From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about Iran, Russia, and the Caucasus. Stretching between the Caspian and the Black Seas, with Russia to the north, Iran to the south, and Turkey to the west, the Caucasus is a geostrategically important region with a growing role in energy, trade, security, and geopolitics. To discuss how the dynamic between Iran and Russia is playing out in the Southern Caucasus and what it means for the countries of the region, I'm joined today by three great guests: Brenda Shaffer, Borshchevskaya, and Alex Vatanka. Brenda is a specialist on Azerbaijan and the Caucasus, energy and foreign policy, energy security, and energy issues in the Caspian and Eastern Mediterranean. She's currently a visiting researcher at Georgetown University's Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies, and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. Anna is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute, focusing on Russia's policy towards the Middle East. She's also a PhD candidate at George Mason University and a fellow at the European Foundation for Democracy. Alex is a senior fellow here at MEI and specializes in Middle Eastern regional security affairs with a particular focus on Iran. And let's start with you. Russia obviously has a long shared history with the Southern Caucasus, from the Tsarist period up through the Soviet Union to the present. What are Moscow's main interests in the Caucasus today, and how does it perceive the region?
Sure. Thank you. It's great to be here. I think one of Moscow's interests is a long-standing one when it comes to Moscow's fears of these countries following into the Western sphere of influence. So one issue remains to be the so-called frozen conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan. I say so-called frozen conflict because ultimately these conflicts are never truly frozen. But there's a very interesting undercurrent dynamic that doesn't receive enough attention, and that is how Russia continues to play an important role in that region, as well as with Georgia for other issues as well.
Alex, pivoting over to you, Iran has longstanding ties with the region as well, both historically as well as currently. It has obviously a large ethnic Azeri population, a smaller ethnic Armenian population in Iran, as well as significant energy and trade links for the region. What does Tehran's relationship with the Southern Caucasus look like today, and what are kind of its main foreign policy priorities in the region?
You know, since these states became independent back in 1991, it's been up and down, a fair amount, I would say. But I would probably characterize relations right now as some of the best I've seen in this 25 plus years. I mean, the one country that really stands out, and most of the tensions have been between Tehran and Baku, Azerbaijan. That relationship right now seems to be, at least on surface, pretty cordial. Now, we can get into why that might be the case. Love to hear what Brenda has to say about it. But, you know, Rouhani was just in Baku. They're talking about partnership in all sorts of areas. And that, compared to the past, is actually pretty good. It's a sign of perhaps maturity on the part of Iranian, at least, approach to these states, because as you pointed out, there's a lot of history here. Good part of the South Caucasus historically was part of the Persian Empire. There are elements in Iran that haven't come over the fact that, look, these are independent states now. Treat them as such. But I think perhaps we're getting to a point where that respect is now coming. That would be welcome news. And yet I have to end with this, which was troubling. When Rouhani returned from Baku, he said on his return that, yes, great trip to Azerbaijan, and I think we can have some kind of a Shia alliance between Iran, Azerbaijan, and Iraq, Shia majority countries. Now, anybody who knows anything about the Republic of Azerbaijan would tell you that is not going to be welcome news. That's not where Azerbaijan wants to go. It's a secular state. It's proud to be a secular state. So I don't know if that was just Rouhani not really knowing what he was talking about, or if that's some kind of reflection of deeper thinking in Iran. Because if it's the latter, and they're thinking of bringing Azerbaijan into the Iranian model, very quickly they're going to find relations will deteriorate.
Brenda, I'm curious to get your thoughts on that point. One would think on paper that Iran would support Azerbaijan as a fellow Shia majority country, and that might be reciprocated. But obviously that hasn't been the case, and historically it's had closer ties with Christian Armenia. Why is that?
Yeah, I think religion plays no role in the alliances in the South Caucasus, and I think through analyzing that, you can see it actually teaches you a lot about Iran, because we tend to think of Iran as, if you ask sort of almost any kind of generally educated person, is Islam an important element of Iranian foreign policy? And they would look at you, well, of course it is. And if you'd say, and Shia solidarity is, of course it is. But when you analyze the Caucasus and you see that it's the exact opposite, Iran has the most concrete cooperation with Armenia of the three countries. And as Alex pointed out, well, maybe today they're on the rhetorical level much calmer than in the past, but have had the most problematic relations with Shia majority Azerbaijan. The same thing, some point to Russia and Armenia sharing a common Orthodox church as a basis for alliance, but then how do you explain Russian-Georgian conflicts and occupation? So basically, religion and culture have nothing to do with the alliances. And I think in Iran and the South Caucasus, it's like the poster child for realpolitik in its activities towards the region. I mean, essentially, in the Karabakh War, which Anya mentioned, about 850,000 Shias were uprooted, lost their homes in this war, and you don't hear, and you see cordial visits of Armenian officials in Iran. Pashinyan in February was in Iran. And there are actually been protests of Iranian Azerbaijanis against his visit. Here, like, this guy is occupying Azerbaijani land, created refugees, and you don't see a peep, from the government. So when it's convenient for them, they support Shia, they support Muslims. But when it's real politically, they pay a cost. We see that they definitely put their ideological rhetoric in a box, and geopolitical interests supersede their alliance choices.
Kind of riffing off of that point, how would you say kind of more broadly that Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia go about balancing their ties with both Iran and Russia?
Yeah, I would say what's also interconnected with the West. I think you can't look at their orientations towards Russia and Iran without looking at their ties with the United States, because it's kind of a triangle. So if you could say after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the three South Caucasus states found themselves three very weak, small states with big, post-war Armenia and Georgia with big refugee populations. And they chose three completely different strategies for how to deal with their geopolitical environment. So let's say Georgia said, let's go, the full USA, fully in the American camp, very antagonistic towards Russia, which was occupying some of their territories, sort of on Iran as cooperative as possible, but anytime, something like U.S. sanctions, they were definitely on board with the United States. And so in that way, they're kind of the darling of Washington of the three countries, but they have the most problematic relations with Russia and kind of mediocre relations with Iran. Armenia took the exact opposite approach, which was 100%, Russia's here, is in the area. Their airspace is integrated with Russia. They have two Russian bases in Armenia. Russian companies control the commanding heights of the Armenian economy. That got them strong protection and actually the ability to stay in the territories they conquered, but it created, an isolation and very problematic relationship with the United States. Like, for instance, if we're seeing currently on Iran sanctions, where they're very, they don't want to comply with Iran sanctions, but on the other hand, they want a close relationship with the United States. Azerbaijan sort of went on the fence. It's the only country in the world that has the honor of bordering Russia and Iran. not easy. Tried to not go full way into the United States, not full with Russia. Try to manage Iran as much as possible. And that has advantages and disadvantages. It keeps them with their independence from any of these powers, but also with no real strategic backer like Georgia and Armenia have. Further complicating the issue, and I assume Alex is going to talk about this as well, is that a third of the population of Iran is ethnic Azerbaijanis. And so anything in Iran's foreign policy towards Republic of Azerbaijan or Azerbaijan's policy towards Iran, this domestic issue is a very big factor.
No, I mean, obviously it is a big factor. I think, Brenda and I have been on programs before where we talked about the last time there was open hostilities between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and Iran managed to stay out of it because, that happened at the time where the Soviet Union was sort of collapsing. And the knowledge inside Iran about what was going on was very limited. In other words, people inside Iran, ethnic Azeris, weren't in the know and certainly weren't mobilizing in large numbers. Today, quarter century after Azerbaijani independence, there are connections between the two peoples. And God forbid, should there be a conflict, I think if you're sitting in Tehran, you wonder, Can we manage, if there is mass anger among ethnic Azeris here, to side with their cousins in the Republic of Azerbaijan? Because that would throw everything sort of off, if you will, and it would really be a challenge to the policy of the Islamic Republic, as Brenda described it, towards Armenia. It would be a big test for them. I don't think they're looking forward to have to deal with that one day, and I hope they don't have to, but that's a question.
We've alluded to it a couple of times here, Alex, but I wanted to ask directly about how the U.S. maximum pressure campaign has affected kind of Iran's foreign policy calculations in the Caucasus. Does it, and kind of the increase in tensions in the Middle East more broadly, does it mean it's less of a priority? Does it mean it's more of an opportunity that, because everything else is so complicated elsewhere, they can kind of focus on that? Or what's the kind of read on that in Tehran?
Well, I mean, Alistair, the South Caucasus, I think, if I'm not wrong, roughly as three countries combined would have a population of 15 million people. So the marketplace is not huge, and they're not necessarily interested in the types of things Iran has to offer. I mean, there are limited gas transfers and so on. There are energy swaps, and these are all good, but these are not on a strategic level. This is not the kind of trade Iran has with, say, India or China or the European Union. So no, I mean, in terms of economic priority, the South Caucasus are not the big deal for Iran. Although, interestingly enough, in the context of maximum pressure, what the Iranians have found themselves is that there's so much heat on them in terms of what they're doing, who they're trading with, how to transfer the money. There's been an emphasis on Iran's immediate countries. And if you listen to the Iranian Foreign Ministry, the emphasis is these countries that are nearby, they're actually much easier to trade with because you can get stuff back of a truck, get it over and get whatever in a barter deal or cash, and you can get some economic activity going on, whereas you can't do that with some of the other traditional trading partners like South Korea on the other side of the planet. So that has created some limited opportunities in terms of trade, I think. I mean, on this trip that I mentioned earlier, Iran and Azerbaijan are talking about a joint car production venture, which is very fascinating. And that, to me, is more of a political gesture. I think the Iranians do want to convey to the world that they're not isolated as a result of the maximum pressure. It maybe makes sense commercially. Brenda can talk about that. But I think the maximum pressure campaign has not really overall changed the fact that for Iran, the South Caucasus remains a secondary issue. Ideologically, this Iranian regime is obsessed with the Arab world. And I think it will come to pay a big price for it, as we're seeing right now in Iraq and Lebanon. It's sticking its fingers into all sorts of pies in the region, and it is going to be seen as a player and not necessarily a good player. And the locals, and I'm going away from the key point here of the South Caucasus, but the point I'm trying to make is they're distracted. And if you're distracted, as the Iranian regime is, even if there are opportunities in the South Caucasus, unfortunately, the Iranians are not paying enough attention.
I'm curious to get your perspective, the kind of Russian view on the relationship between Russia and Iran, specifically within the context of the kind of Southern Caucasus. How does it fit into that broader dynamic between the two countries? They've got a pretty multifaceted, pretty complicated relationship. I don't know what we would describe it as, a marriage of convenience, frenemies. I'm not really sure what terms one would use, but obviously a wide variety of factors, from the political to energy ties, from Syria to Central Asia. How does the South Caucasus fit into that dynamic?
Yeah, well, let me start by actually saying I would characterize the Russia-Iran relationship as a partnership. It's not a formal alliance, obviously, in a treaty sense, and it is a very complex and multifaceted one, to be sure, but you don't really see Russia and Iran conflicting in a way that many had predicted. And the reason for it is their common larger geostrategic goals of reducing American influence in the Middle East. So as long as these larger goals continue to coincide, for all of their problems underneath the surface, I think Russia and Iran will continue to put these differences aside. Now, as far as how does the South Caucasus fit into this, I'm really glad we're talking about this topic because it doesn't get a lot of attention. This region, the South Caucasus, sits at the crossroads of Middle East and Europe, and whatever happens in the Middle East often reverberates in this region. What's interesting is how this region played out in the Russian-Syria intervention. You had one thing many haven't paid attention to is the fact that after Russia intervened in Syria, it also intensified its presence in Armenia, which was already, as Brenda talked about, it was already deep and multifaceted to begin with. Russia also pressured Armenia to participate in the so-called, quote-unquote, humanitarian mission that Russia had in Syria in favor of Assad. So
just to interject on the humanitarian mission, that's on the rhetorical level, but these were Armenian troops. And I think it was really important because they tried to say, well, we were there just to help the Armenian community and medical care, but they could have done that as NGOs. And as you said, Russia made sure it was actual troops because they wanted the legitimacy to their own deployment there.
That's
actual
right.
Boots on the ground.
That's right. Actual boots on the ground. Exactly. Yeah. But Brenda is absolutely right about it. So it's an underreported dynamic of the Syria situation, for one thing. And I, as Alex said, it's interesting that I think there's a lot of similarities. I don't think that in the sense that the South Caucasus for Russia also are not a priority in a sense, similarly to the way Alex talked about Iran. But it doesn't mean it's not important. To me, that quote-unquote humanitarian mission especially showed how much influence Russia really has in this region, particularly in Armenia. And Brenda made up another important point about Armenia in the beginning. Because Armenia chose to move closer to Russia, and as Brenda said, it afforded Armenia a certain degree of protection. Well, protection from Russia always comes with a cost, as we know.
That's a good point.
And there's a reason why Armenia is so isolated right now. The Nagorno-Karabakh conflict remains unresolved in large part because Moscow doesn't want it resolved. Moscow likes a situation of a quote-unquote frozen conflict where sort of low-level instability simmers and Russia gets to play sort of a key mediator role. And that, I would argue, remains Russia's priority in the region, but also that reverberates in the Middle East, frankly. I think you're going to see that dynamic there as well. And as far as the Russia-Iran dynamic on top of this, you don't see a whole lot of conflict. This is very paradoxical and maybe hard to understand from a Western perspective. Russian officials simultaneously compete with Iran, but they also see it as a partner. And in fact, they say so directly. Lavrov actually made direct comments in that regard.
I just maybe want to follow up on the maximum pressure and the impact on Iran and Iran's relations with the South Caucasus. So I concur completely with Alex that even though the South Caucasus aren't important trading partners, but on the legitimacy issue to show that Iran isn't isolated, they really have, I think, been doing a big push on the trade, including issues such as, gas export. If you look at Pashinyan's recent visit to Tehran, so they're, talking about using Armenia as a transit state, for gas, which would probably mean, it was a goal of getting into Europe. So this fits into our discussion because one, probably, the country, if we look at their behavior in the past, that has been most adamant in preventing the Iranian export of gas through Armenia, it's actually Russia. As much as Anya pointed out that they're partners and not alliance, you see it very much in the gas relations where, sure, we like to cooperate with Tehran, but stay out of our markets in Europe. And in fact, in 2007, when a gas pipeline was first initiated between Armenia and Iran and opened in 2009, Gazprom bought up that gas pipeline, even though it has a very small market, it's not meaningful, but just to impose on it a small circumference and make sure that it couldn't be used to transit, big volumes to Europe. So we see that those issues, and I think that with the second stage of U.S. sanctions on Iran, with the maximum pressure getting even more maximum, if they go into the field of gas, this will have huge impact on Iran's relations with its neighbor. So whether it's Iran's gas trade with Armenia, with its gas transit for Azerbaijan, and also this affects, if there'll be sanctions on gas, it affects Iran's inability to export gas liquids, condensate liquids, could actually impact its ability to produce gas at home, because this is a lot of associated liquids that if you don't have anywhere to put them, you can't keep up with your gas production. So this could even create blackouts in Iran itself, heat disruptions, and so it's in some way it's very much interlinked to its gas export, and production is also its gas liquid exports.
I mean, on the theme of being cordial, which I think we all sort of agree seems to be a headline for so many of these relations. I think, one of the things that I haven't heard for a good while, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Iran used to have a challenge to Azerbaijan. If you want to have good relations with us, you have to ditch Israel. That hasn't happened. And I wonder what that means, at least on a rhetorical level. Maybe they're saying that quietly to the officials in Baku, you have to do that. But it's not part of the messaging anymore. I certainly don't pick it up, which is very interesting. It's an admission on the part of the Iranians that, look, we can't tell people who they can have relations with, because that's what we're saying to the Europeans. They shouldn't listen to the Americans when it comes to the question of Iran. We're going to be guilty of doing the same thing. So very interesting. On energy, I don't think we're there yet. There's a lot of talk about the so-called north-south or south-north corridor linking up Russia to the subcontinent. The Russian officials keep talking about it. There's talk about maybe the port of Chabahar being partially given to. I don't know if these are just make you feel good news items that are coming out of Iran, that we're not isolated, or if really the Russians. Because in many ways it makes sense for Russia to be strategically involved in Iran's only deep seaport, that, instead of giving it to the Indians or the Chinese. And it also makes even more point and I'm certainly no energy expert, but when I think about the fact that Iran has the second largest natural gas reserves in the world after Russia. And if you're Russia, Brenda talked about what Russia's doing from a defensive point of view, keep the Iranian gas from Europe. But they could maybe even be more bold and go on the offensive by getting to be a bigger player in the Iranian energy market, buy up energy assets. Now, I'm not sure the Iranians are going to go there, but the fact is that the Russians bought one of the largest refineries in India, Essar refinery. And the whole aim behind the Essar refinery deal was we get Iranian oil. Russia buys the refinery, 49% stake in India. Iranian oil goes, and the Russians are the ones who manage the whole thing. The Indians, because of U.S. sanctions, have decided not to get that. But the thinking is very interesting, isn't it? Russia isn't just a producer of the oil gas. It also increasingly could become the intermediary, the one that actually handles so much. Certainly in a country with so much oil and gas as Iran, but also so isolated, seems to be an attractive offer on the table if the Russians can get the Iranians convinced, or the Iranians are so isolated they have no option but to go with the Russians.
I wanted to add, the sense that I get is that Iran really is isolated. And frankly, the sanctions that were put on Iran were so much more far-reaching than the sanctions on Russia. It's far more complicated to sanction Russia to the degree that Iran was ever sanctioned. And so an added reason why, at least I've seen Iran keeps working with Russia for all of their difficulties is because Iran really just has very few friends left.
Lack of other options, right. Basically, lack of better choices. I'm curious to kind of bring things back to the maximum pressure campaign and the kind of noticeable uptick in U.S. interest and involvement in the Caucasus in the last year or so, with National Security Advisor John Bolton visiting the region in the fall, former National Security Advisor, I should say. Brenda, what's driving that? Is it all about maximum pressure? Are there other things going on? What's your kind of sense there?
Yeah, definitely in the case with John Bolton, and I think under his successor, I just recently read his 2006 book, and it seems to have share a very similar geopolitical outlook. We've talked informally how Washington puts an artificial border between the Middle East and the former Soviet Union, as even though the Caucasus directly borders Iran, when they think of Iran policy, they think of Dubai, they think of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, but they don't realize that Iran has a northern border, and that a lot of it is just because let's say a European and Eurasian division in the State Department or in the NSC is separate from the Middle East. But I think Secretary Bolton really more than got it. For years has actually understands that these are bordering regions, contingent regions, and as we discussed before, when a third of the population of Iran is ethnic Azerbaijani. Even Khamenei himself, when he speaks with Azerbaijani officials, he speaks in the Azerbaijani language. I think that they realize, sort of a strong and attractive and secular Azerbaijan, it could be a attractive point for Iran's ethnic Azerbaijanis. I frequently visit in Azerbaijan, and you just see really the huge tourism from Iran, also from the Gulf. And we see, people coming over to basically Baku, as I hope I won't offend anyone, but basically a big party town, and seeing that, on the other hand, it's tolerant, or there's a place for people in Islamic dress and hijab, or if they want halal, but if in the same family they want to, go out and party, the city has a place for both. And I think it's one thing for an Iranian, let's say an observant Iranian, to go to Europe and see, oh, this is the way those people act. But seeing sort of brother Shia, in this respect, I think it has some influence on Iran. I think the U.S. government, certainly under advisor Bolton, really got that. And in fact, if you look at the demonstrations going on in Iran in the past year and a half, I'd love to hear also Alex's view on this. You see that the ethnic element, is really prominent. So if you look at most pundits or journalists that have talked about these demonstrations, they talk about the provinces, they talk about the lack of centers, but they don't use the E word, the ethnic minorities, because the provinces, who are the provinces? That's the non-Persian population. And this not only are they non-Persians, but they have co-ethnic ties with other ethnic minorities. So when you're seeing, for instance, in Ahvaz, an attack on the military parade and the Revolutionary Guards, our American press has been saying, "Oh, this is an attack of a province," but those are all ethnic Arabs. Or when you have the 2017 terrorist attacks on the Iranian parliament and the mausoleum, so Tehran says these were ISIS, or I think that time they said Al Qaeda. These are Sunni extremists, but they were Kurds. And from Iran, right? Or you're seeing constantly border guards, Iranian border guards killed in borders with Kurdish populations next door in Turkey or Iraq, or shelling villages. You have Iraqi forces constantly telling them, you're shelling our forces in Iraq, and they're saying our village, and they're saying, sorry, we meant to hurt our own Kurds, not yours. By the way, with all the discussions right now in Washington about the question of relations with the Kurdish communities in the Middle East, we hear a lot of talk about Kurds in Syria, Kurds in Turkey. The research piece, what about Kurds in Iran? I'm seeing very little publications or talk about that, that piece of the puzzle.
I just want to make one or two comments. One of the conclusions I've made from my trips to certainly Georgia is that, and I think that might be true for the other two states in South Caucasus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, is, the legacy of the Soviet Union is alive in some ways still. And one of them, which is alive not only in the region, but also the way Washington perceives the region, is, to your point about, are they part of the Middle East, close to the Middle East, should they have a Middle East policy? I get the sense that they are so focused on Europe and the West that for them, not necessarily deliberately, they just don't know much about the Middle East. South Caucasian citizens don't go to Middle East for their holiday destinations and so on. So there's a real disconnect. Even though proximity-wise, they ought to be at the forefront of being concerned about events in Iraq or Syria, because if there is a big flow of, say, refugees or drugs, they'll be right there getting it first before it travels to Europe. But there's this perception that, there's nothing good coming out of the Middle East. Our future, particularly in the case of Georgia, is European Union, is NATO membership and so on. And that's all fine, but those are long-term interests that can be cultivated. There ought to be policies, and I think U.S. can help them in that sense as a partner to prepare for, short-term emergencies should something go wrong to the south of these three states in the South Caucasus.
Absolutely. It reminds me of somebody who used to live in Turkey, very much of Turkey pre-AKP. In terms of how it perceives the region.
Yeah, and to add to what Alex said, Russia remains a very important element for that reason, for all of these countries. Again, differently for each country, but Russia is important for each of these countries. And of course, Georgia remains an aspirant NATO member. I think that's the official term. Armenia, after the Velvet Revolution, also had taken some very, very slow, extraordinarily cautious steps to try to move away from Russia. And I think they saw how difficult it really is. And I would say Azerbaijan, if anything, has more flexibility in this regard. But certainly, very differently for each of these countries, Russia remains an important priority. And I agree with Alex, actually, at least I've never been to Georgia or Azerbaijan, but I've lived in Armenia several years ago. And I would agree, I think, at least from my Armenian experience, they don't know the Middle East very well, even though Iranians regularly visit Armenia. In fact, I remember seeing somebody told me apartment complexes that the Iranians were purchasing. So again, they understand them, but they don't understand, Iran understands them, but not the other way around, yeah.
Just to point out that as Russia and Iran have become more sanctioned and isolated, and their currency, it's difficult for, Russians can maybe still travel abroad, but their currency has a lot less value abroad. You're seeing a lot more tourism into the South Caucasus. And I think that, by the way, any students looking for, a dissertation topic or book topic, it's fascinating to see this sort of meeting ground. There also, Azerbaijan, for instance, has a huge influx of Iranian and Israeli tourists. You go to restaurants, Hava Nagila's play and everyone's drinking, and some aren't, some are. I mean, it's
and there's Farsi and Hebrew.
Yeah. and half of the Israelis actually know Farsi from their parents. And it's a lot of fun. But I think there is. I think for also on sanctions issues, there are a lot of businesses that have been set up in the South Caucasus. Some Iranians I know Iranian Azerbaijanis have been buying up property in Nakhchivan, which is a region contingent. Sort of like if things don't go well, we need to be able to to move. And I think, as Alex said, that if there's any major instability in Iran, there'll be outflow to the Gulf, but certain, maybe even more, even into the North Caucasus. And you're even seeing things, for instance, Georgian brides are becoming very popular among Iranians because now with a visa-free regime to Europe, the Georgian passport has become very valuable. So the politics are interconnected even to this human interaction taking place.
We're running over and we should wrap things up, but kind of any final thoughts? Any thoughts on how you see Russia-Iran relations in the region developing going forward?
I would say for Iran, that definitely the one thing they should not do, and it's probably hard for the Islamic Republic to sort of resist the temptation, but it's to respect the independence of these three states, certainly refrain from any attempt to export the Islamist model of the Islamic Republic. The idea sometimes that you hear from hardliners that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the Iranian supreme leader, is the supreme leader of all Shias, that is the sort of talk that will backfire. It might have a minority of Azeris as an audience, but that will be a tiny percentage. And if they are going to focus on the well-being of Iranian people or the well-being of the people of the South Caucasus, they ought to start thinking about trade, economic ties, confidence building, and not interfering in the affairs of their smaller neighbors to the north.
I think from a U.S. policy perspective, it's really important to pay more attention to this region. And Brenda mentioned earlier, I think, John Bolton's trip to the region, which showed, at least at that moment in time, an increased focus on the South Caucasus. Russian influence is very strong in that region, but the United States can still look for ways to work with civil society. Again, Georgia remains especially pro-Western oriented out of all of these countries. So I think that's from a U.S. policy angle. It's not easy to reduce Russian influence. Again, Armenia, I think, is experiencing that especially, but it doesn't mean it cannot be done. And frankly, Georgia is an example of that.
I would say, with all the instability taking place in Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, something that seems very different than anything we've seen before. I think that the Middle East is going to be looking for new models, and something that especially I welcome this new series here at the Middle East Institute is that Azerbaijan and the states of Central Asia have complete, Muslim majority countries with complete separation of religion and state, no state religion, they have the French laïcité model of no religious studies in schools. And I think if for this model of, civic-based identity probably is going to be starting to become more interesting ideologically in the Middle East, and they should take a look. And second, that the Caucasus and Iran's stability is really interconnected, maybe even more than things in the Gulf because of the multi-ethnic composition of Iran. And I suggest, if anyone wants to see any element of it on it, watch a Tractor Azerbaijan game. It's a soccer team. Yes, I do watch it. Yes, I do.
I've looked at their at their Twitter account as
Yes,
well.
my kids aren't believing they're listening to and say, "Mom's watching soccer." But it's fascinating because one of the only places in Iran where you could legally demonstrate, where you don't need a permit that's going to be refused, is a soccer stadium. And to see 30 to sometimes 80,000 people demonstrating, from ethnic chants to allowing girls to attend the soccer games, to even death to Khamenei. So it's fascinating to watch. And again, another potential dissertation topic for someone listening here.
A fascinating region, but I think we'll have to leave things there for today. Brenda, Alex, Anna, thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in, and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.